Hello again, it's Steve Smith and this is my CPD presentation number 27 and it's on the topic of comprehensible input. Now, if you're at all new to reading research about second language learning and teaching, you might not have come across the phrase comprehensible input. It sounds slightly technical, but it really isn't. It's language which learners understand, whether it be in speech or writing. So it's meaningful language input. And in a way, if you think about this, it would be strange if you taught without using comprehensible input at any stage. Either students wouldn't get any input, or they'd be getting input which they simply don't understand and which they cannot process, and therefore cannot learn language from. And researchers are in general agreement that comprehensible input is the foundation of language acquisition there. That's a paraphrase of a quotation from Lightbound and Sparda's book, How Languages Are Learned. I suppose the debate in language teaching and in the research is it enough? And what else do we require in language lessons apart from target language input which students can understand? Now, when we think of comprehensible input, we're bound to think of the researcher Stephen Krashen, who really started writing about this in the late 1970s, although the idea that we pick up language just through contact with it, through exposure to language we understand, is not at all new, but he was, if you like, bringing up to date an idea that had been around for many, many centuries. And his fundamental hypothesis, called the input hypothesis, is that essentially we acquire a language, whether it be our first language or our second, by understanding messages. Simple as that. And actually, given the simplicity of the message, you can see how it appealed to teachers, particularly in an era when the grammar translation approach and when audiolingual drilling and quite formal approaches to language teaching were in vogue, which were used in most classrooms and which are still used in many classrooms. So the context here of his hypothesis was important. It seemed to many teachers to be quite revolutionary at the time. Although if you study at all the background to movements in language teaching, the reform movement in Europe of the late 19th century, early 20th century was already really talking about the same sort of thing, that it's not a great way to teach a language, to describe it, to give rules, and study lists of vocabulary, let's say, and then hope that students will acquire a language. So even the reformers back in the early 20th century realized that target language was the key to acquisition. But along with his input hypothesis, let me just briefly digress and mention Krashen's other hypotheses. And the first one is the acquisition learning hypothesis, the idea that there are two types of learning, which he labeled acquisition and learning. In the history of this, it could have been labeled unconscious learning versus conscious learning, natural learning versus classroom learning, if you like. And there is some support, in fact, from cognitive science that we do learn in different ways, and that when we pick up things unconsciously, implicitly, it's one part of the brain that's, if you like, working on that input, whereas when we do formal study of a language, it's another part of the brain, and there has been research into this. Whether you can make that clear distinction between these two types of learning is still open to debate. But Krashen used that hypothesis to surmise that essentially we pick up languages through acquisition, not through learning, not through formal study. Now, tied up with that was his monitor hypothesis. And this is the idea that when we study language formally and look at the grammar, the morphology, the structural properties of a language, that can help us with our acquisition, but only in terms of us being able to monitor our own accuracy as we're speaking. And as you'll know yourself, if you're speaking a language which is not your first, and sometimes even your first language actually, you are aware of moments when you have to think, what's the rule there? Is it this ending or that ending? Is it this gender or that gender? So we are constantly, particularly in second language use, if you're not perfectly fluent, monitoring our performance. So for Krashen then, the learning part, if you like, the formal study, feeds into the monitor. The natural order hypothesis was based on research on the order in which people seem to acquire certain grammatical structures, notably morphemes, word parts. And there is certainly research to support that in first language acquisition, and probably to some extent in second language acquisition, the order in which students acquire grammatical structures is somewhat immune to teaching. In other words, what we teach and the particular order we teach it in does not correspond with the order in which students seem to actually acquire the structure to be able to use it spontaneously. And any practicing teacher knows this to be at least partly true. You can spend a long time on certain structures which students don't seem to pick up, whereas others they seem to pick up quickly. It's as if they're developmentally ready to pick up some structures ahead of others. And there could be reasons for this. It could be to do with something going on in the brain. It could be to do with the frequency with which students hear structures. In other words, if they hear them more often in the classroom, are they more likely to acquire them? Or it could be to do with transfer effects from the first language. Are some structures in the second language fundamentally harder because they are different to those in the first language? To give you an example, I found this to be the case with object pronouns in French, and because the word order is different in French, it seemed to be that that was harder for students to acquire than certain other structures, shall we say. And lastly, here's effective filter hypothesis, the idea that we only really learn language when we want to, when we're happy in the process, when we are emotionally inclined to want to learn. So this would, if you like, speak in favour of the classroom which is supportive, where anxiety is reduced, where self-efficacy is raised. And you can read more about that in Krashen's book, Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, which is freely available. I'll give you the reference at the end. So I mentioned earlier whether comprehensible input was enough. And research has moved on since Krashen's time, and the answer to this seems to be no. We do need to interact with the input we receive. And in addition, there's more and more evidence coming from research that it is useful to teach the formal properties of language, to talk about the language and to do controlled exercises on aspects of the language. It seems that this is more useful in terms of accuracy, but generally speaking, researchers are of the view now that teaching students to practice certain parts of the language, what's called focus on form, helps with your general proficiency. But certainly the value of interaction has to be mentioned here. Communication, using the language. And you know, if there's one really simple takeaway here, I'd say for teachers, particularly new teachers, is that we get better at learning a language by using it, not talking about it. And there is a danger that as a teacher, you can be very interested in aspects like grammar and the formal properties of language, but if you spend too much time talking about those and neglect actually using the language for communication, then it's likely that your students won't acquire as much proficiency as quickly. In the United States, there's a term that's actually used, CI, teachers, if you like, teachers who are proud, if you like, to say that they teach through comprehensible input, not traditional grammar. But actually, those teachers usually do, as far as I can glean, teach grammar, but even if they believe it just helps students to monitor their accuracy. So in terms of practical skills in the classroom, if you're learning the craft of teaching, these are ideas which we put in our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, about how we can help keep the language comprehensible. Because a key point to make here is that, of course, input can be comprehensible, but it has to become intake. It has to be language that students listen to, read, and actually process, so that it can find its way into their long-term memory, or what's sometimes called their mental representation of the language. Now, how can language become internalized so that it can be used spontaneously? So these are, if you like, practical classroom tips for you. So in general here, certainly it's about pitching your language at the right level in the classroom, it's very easy to overestimate what students take in. Even quite able classes, the danger is that you're pitching the language at too hard a level for them. Bear in mind that our short-term memory, our working memory, is very limited, and particularly with beginners who don't have much long-term memory knowledge to draw on. They're having to process a lot in real time, and so it's very easy to overload them with too much language or language which is too difficult. That means usually you modify the input that you give them. So you might simplify the syntax you use, you might use simple sentences, you might avoid subordinate clauses, and you might avoid loading students with too much new vocabulary. That means you might favour cognates if you're teaching a European language, or you might favour vocabulary that they've encountered before, because you know that by repetition of vocabulary, students are more likely to remember it. In general, my own advice would be to not go at native speaker speed, to build in repetition, rephrasing as you speak, and pausing. That's not to say that there might not be occasions when you want to expose students to native speaker speech, spoken normally, authentically as it were, because ideally you don't want students coming back to you to say, well, the way they speak in the country is not like the way you speak in class. I think there's a case for including elements of native speaker authentic speech. Let students ask you questions, get clarification, encourage them to tell you when they don't understand. Generic teacher skills such as keeping eye contact with as many students as possible, using your facial expression to enhance meaning. The phrase teach to the eyes is sometimes used. Other generic skills would include, for example, varying your physical position in the class, occasionally moving to the back of the classroom, not necessarily prowling around impatiently, nervously. Sometimes standing very still can be effective, but scanning left to right, scanning from front to back, involving every student in the classroom. There's even research to suggest that students tend to mirror your own personality, and if you're able to bring humour into your lessons, this can produce more engagement from classes. In fact, it was Rachel Hawkes who, in her PhD dissertation, mentions that students echo teachers' behaviour in this way, and they're more likely to use language spontaneously when they're relaxed. To go back to Krashen's affective filter, students learn better and are more likely to produce if their affective filter is lowered, to use that jargon term. I would not encourage 100% target language use myself. Certainly translation can help to make language comprehensible, and if you're keen on the sort of sentence builder lexicogrammar approach, where on your sentence builder frame you include language in English, then clearly the reason for that is to make sure that all language is comprehensible. And therefore, I wouldn't worry about showing English if it serves the greater purpose, which is to make language comprehensible. As long as you're not using English too much, because if you do that, inevitably the amount of comprehensible input will go down. Good teachers often use gesture, pictures, classroom objects. It's not unusual to find language teachers who use gesture a lot in their real lives. Perhaps you do yourself. Routines can be useful as well if you have a predictable questioning style, certain patterns of choral and individual repetition. Students like routines. That's not an argument for making every lesson the same, but if you're predictable in your routines, that might encourage more engagement, more interaction with the input. It's often a good idea to reinforce listening input with the written word, writing words and chunks up on the board, or providing transcripts of dialogues or listening texts, so that at every stage the language is as comprehensible as possible. And you'll be aware of sort of formative assessment techniques, assessment for learning techniques, such as using mini whiteboards to allow you to check for meaning. And there are lots of ways of using those. Probably a good idea not to talk for too long because of issues of cognitive load, which I mentioned earlier. Observe when a class may be losing concentration or enthusiasm. Use your emotional and cognitive empathy skills. A key skill for teachers of cognitive empathy, having the sense that you're pitching the work at the right level for the class in front of you. So in a typical sort of teacher-led classroom routine, this is one that we put in our book, and which was actually adapted from a book by Nava and Pedrozzini, if you want to look up those names, Nava and Pedrozzini. But I changed the language here. And so here's a sort of comprehensible input routine which builds in repetition and interaction with the class. So if you don't mind, I will just read this to you. So, are you sporty? I love sport. I'm very sporty. I play football, tennis. I love to go walking. Do you like sport? Yeah? Hands up if you like sport. Lionel Messi is sporty, isn't he? Harry Kane's sporty. Who else is sporty? Rafael Nadal? Yes, he's sporty. Is Homer Simpson sporty? No. Homer loves sport. No, he loves donuts. Is an elephant sporty? No. Is a hippopotamus sporty? No. Altogether, sporty. So in that sort of typical classroom routine, you can see how much repetition we've built in with natural input in a somewhat, obviously, contrived exchange, but that's the nature of the classroom. And I think that gives you an idea of how you can stay in the target language, keep input comprehensible, even down to choosing words, by the way, such as elephant and hippopotamus, which in the language I taught, French, would have been cognate words. So they would have been good ones to choose rather than animals which weren't cognates. For a few references there, I mentioned our book Breaking the Sound Barrier, and there's the Krashen reference that's available online as a PDF to read, and Lightbound and Sparta's book How Languages Are Learned. And for more information about this and many of the other things that I've been talking about in the screencasts, have a look at our 3 books: The Language Teacher Toolkit, Breaking the Sound Barrier, and my own book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll join me again for another one of these screencasts. Do subscribe to the channel and check out others in the series. Thank you for listening.